Today's topic is getting your board on board and talking about how to communicate floodplain management with local leadership. The objective today is to just go over different messaging about the importance of the National Flood Insurance Program and your community's participation in it. Um, we're going to go over um, encouraging proactive decision making with floodplain management practices in mind. Community leadership is a big part of floodplain management and can directly influence the ability of a floodplain administrator to fulfill their full responsibilities. So it's critical to have the support of your leadership within the NFIP and meeting the requirements to just make better and safer development decisions. So we will get started. For our agenda, we'll start out with just some basics of the National Flood Insurance Program and how you can effectively communicate the mission for the program. Some responsibilities of the floodplain administrator, responsibilities of the governing body, and how to customize your program to better suit your community's needs, and then just some basic tips and resources at the end. So we'll start off with just communicating the mission of the National Flood Insurance Program. We'll explain different topics and concepts about the NFIP and why it is important in maintaining a floodplain program within your community. So starting off, as it's the floodplain administrator's duty to be the first stop for locals looking for information about the national or about the floodplain and the National Flood Insurance Program. Not very many people know about the program or floodplain regulations, so that can lead to a lot of misinformation spread, which can cause a lot of frustration and concern within community members. Being able to answer basic questions about floodplains and building safer from flooding can help people understand the expectations and benefits of the program. It's the floodplain administrator's job to educate the public. So we'll have some information to help build your knowledge to be able to share that with your community going forward. So, with communicating the mission, there are five areas and questions that you should be prepared to answer. Those general categories are flood insurance, where to find it, how to get a quote, how to get discounts when it is required, floodplain regulations, what are the requirements for developing in the floodplain, the community's responsibilities within the program, the benefits that your community receives by being in the program, and the authority that your community has to implement and enforce these regulations. Um, Knowing the answers to these questions or these categories is just the first step. Then you need to be prepared to share this information, presenting it to your governing body or just your community members. So we'll break it down into kind of three basic aspects of the program. There is the basics in the background of the program, so why the NFIP was created, how it works, expectations, and the kind of background aspects of that. Then there's benefits of participating in the program, so how this helps your community. And then penalties for noncompliance. So, why it's important to enforce the floodplain regulations and maintaining a good standing within the program, and how a poorly enforced program or no program at all can affect your community. All right, so starting with the basics and the background of the program, why was the NFIP created? So, the program was created after frequent and extreme flooding events um, kind of started to prove too much for private insurance companies to keep up with paying out those claims. So, listed on the slide, you have different flooding events that occurred. You have Hurricanes Betsy in 65, Camille in 69, and Agnes in 72. You had the West Coast tsunami of 64, and then different flooding events that several unfortunately occurred in deaths within different communities. After these flooding events became more frequent, private insurance became unaffordable or unavailable for most people. So, federally backed insurance was created to help communities be more resilient, protect lives and property within communities, and to help people rebuild after disasters. So, the National Flood Insurance Program is a federal program. It was established with the passage of the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968, and it establishes property owners in participating communities to, or enables property owners in participating communities to purchase federally backed flood insurance and protection against flood loss. Um, this program is completely voluntary for communities. Communities aren't forced to participate, but it is based on an agreement between local communities and the federal government. This agreement is that the federal government will make flood insurance available within participating communities that adopt and enforce floodplain management regulations to reduce the flood risk within their communities to new floodplain development. Now, the mission of the National Flood Insurance Program, there are kind of three different aspects to that. This program was formed by Congress to mitigate future flood losses. So um, they do this by taking action to reduce flood risk and fund mitigation projects in communities, reduce future flood damage by adopting regulations and enforcing safe development practices to help make communities more resilient during flooding, and provide financial protection for property owners in the floodplain to help fight against flood losses. So to add a little bit more context to the program, in total, it's a pretty large program. There are more than 22,000 communities across the country participating in this program. And within Nebraska, we have about 434 Nebraska jurisdictions that participates. This includes villages, cities, and counties across Nebraska. So this program it's much larger than just one state. It goes across the country, and most Nebraska jurisdictions participate, with many more participating nationally. And it's a very important program and vital to longevity, affordability, and resilience for many communities across the nation. So, moving into some of the benefits of participating in this program. Um, Regardless of if a community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program or not, it is a requirement that if a structure is in a mapped floodplain, flood insurance must be purchased to obtain a federally backed mortgage or loan. So, whether your community participates or not, this is a requirement. And it can be extremely difficult, especially in more rural areas, for people to purchase reasonable flood insurance through the private market. So, by participating in this program, you people have access to that federally backed insurance, which is usually more reasonably priced and available to more people. Participation qualifies the community for federal disaster assistance for flood damages in flood hazard areas, which is a great benefit for communities that experience regular flooding. And then there is reduced loss of life and property due to flooding through local standards for floodplain development. So, by having good floodplain regulations, you're better protecting your community from flood loss. Um, So, when is flood insurance actually required? Um, Homes and businesses in high risk flood areas that have mortgages or loans from a government backed lender are required to have flood insurance. So, this includes FHA and VA loans, loans purchased by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. um, Lenders are regularly audited under the Flood Disaster Protection Act for compliance. So they will require the purchase of flood insurance, and this is called or referred to as the mandatory purchase requirement. Now, you can tell if you're in a high risk flood zone by looking at a firm panel, or you can go on to our interactive map and look at the designated flood zones. They are labeled differently depending on what kind of zone you're in. So, with determining the risk, you have your high risk areas that are typically labeled as Zone A, Zone AE, AH, AO, and then on some maps there are AR and A99. Um, These are your more high risk areas due to proximity to a water source like a pond, stream, river, or protective barrier under construction. On our the image to the right with the high risk meter, it does say zones A or V. V zones are more for coastal areas. We don't have those in Nebraska, so it's easiest to remember. Your high risk zones are any zones starting with an A. Then you do have your moderate to low risk areas. So your shaded X zones, which have a moderate flood risk, or a shaded or an unshaded X zone, which has a lower flood risk. And then on some of the older maps, you do have areas labeled as B, C, or D zones. These areas do not typically have a mandatory purchase requirement for flood risk, only your A zones. So, some of the benefits that your community will receive by participating in the program is, like we mentioned, that access to federally backed flood insurance for everyone in the community's jurisdiction. Your community member does not have to be located within the floodplain to be able to purchase that flood insurance. They can be anywhere within the jurisdiction and have access to it. This flood insurance causes damages caused by flooding, which are or covers damages caused by flooding, which is not typically covered under your standard homeowner's insurance. So it offers that extra layer of protection. And flood insurance is the fastest, most efficient way to recover from flood damages. So it's highly recommended, even for community members that are not located in a high risk flood zone, that they at least explore purchasing flood insurance. There is also a factor with federally backed flood insurance called increased cost of compliance coverage. So, policyholders that experience what's called substantial damage, so if they have a structure that is not in compliant with your current floodplain regulations, that gets damaged by flooding, and the total cost of repairs is 50% or more of the structure's market value, then in order to do those repairs, they would have to bring the structure into compliance with your current regulations. If they meet that threshold, they will qualify for additional funding to help bring their home into compliance. And that is typically up to $30,000 on top of the initial claim that they issue with their insurance company. So there may be some extra costs associated with floodplain regulations, but there are different funding opportunities to help with that as well. So, to qualify for these benefits, again, in order to obtain federal flood insurance, the community has to be a participant in the National Flood Insurance Program, and the community must implement floodplain management as a condition of participation. Now, These floodplain management regulations are done through the adoption and enforcement of floodplain development regulations. This can look like a standalone ordinance that the community adopts or additional floodplain regulations that get incorporated into municipal code, building code, or other regulating documents. The development, in addition to adopting and implementing floodplain regulations, any development in a floodplain must have written permission or what's known as a floodplain development permit. Um, it's important to note that development in the NFIP is defined as any man-made changes to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation, drilling operations, or the storage of equipment or materials. So it's not just structural development that requires a permit or that is subject to floodplain regulations. Any type of development that occurs within the floodplain is subject to these regulations and requires a permit. So, what happens if your community decides not to enforce these floodplain regulations? Um, Again, in order to receive the benefits of the program, the community must be dedicated to promoting public health and safety by remaining eligible for the federally backed flood insurance and enforcing minimum standards for floodplain development that either meets or exceeds state and federal regulations, which we'll get into in just a moment. If the community fails to permit structures in the floodplain or enforce local floodplain regulations, that could lead to probation or suspension from the program. And what does that mean? Probation, there is an additional $50 charge that gets added to flood insurance policies that are sold or renewed during the probationary period. That typically applies for about 1 year, but it can be extended if necessary. And then suspension, if a community gets suspended from the National Flood Insurance Program, they no longer qualify for that federally backed flood insurance. So, new NFIP policy applications cannot be processed, and then existing policies will lapse at their next renewal. So, that eligibility for that flood insurance gets taken away. With this, potential home buyers would not have access to federally backed flood insurance and may have difficulty finding alternate insurance providers. This also affects individuals that have an active federally backed mortgage or loan once their policy lapses. And then for some forms of disaster assistance, they could become unavailable or harder to access for a community, especially for areas within that special flood hazard area zones or within the floodplain. So um, that federal funding for disaster assistance becomes more difficult or unavailable for communities. So now we'll get into some of those floodplain regulations and where that authority comes from to implement those regulations. Starting at the federal level, the federal government has set up minimum standards for floodplain regulations that are listed within the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 44, Part 63. Um, these standards are just the base level for floodplain regulations across the country. Um, but the state of Nebraska has adopted some of our own floodplain standards that exceed the federal standard. So these are within the Nebraska Administrative Code, Title 455, Chapter 1. It includes higher standards such as the expectation for elevation of 1 foot above the freeboard requirement, and also prohibiting structures for residential um, living in the floodway as well. Those are just some examples that Nebraska has adopted that exceed the national standard. And then this is where your authority comes from to be able to adopt and enforce higher floodplain programs within your local community. That is Nebraska Revised Statute, Chapter 31, Article 10. And all of these lead back to your local authority, which is all listed out within a local floodplain ordinance. All participating communities are required to adopt a floodplain ordinance that meets or exceeds federal and state minimum standards. Um, Now, we do have a model ordinance that is available that includes all of the state and federal minimums and then additional regulations, which we'll talk about later on in this presentation. But um, everything you need to know about your community's floodplain program is within the ordinance. Now, we recommend if you don't know where your ordinance is at, um, you can contact us and we can help either find it or help you adopt a new one. But it's really important to make sure your regulations stay current and up to date um, with that. All right. So next we will go into the National Flood Insurance Program in Nebraska. So how it's being implemented within our state. Like we mentioned before, Nebraska has 434 participating communities in the National Flood Insurance Program, and we have um, over $1 billion in total coverage across the state. Around 70% of those policies are for residential structures. And then we have just some basic statistics for coverage and premiums for policies across the state. And then this is just some information that was collected after the 2019 flooding that occurred in Nebraska. So, after the 2019 flooding, 40% of those claims came from outside the regulatory floodplain. So, again, it's important for individuals who aren't even necessarily directly at risk of flooding or located within the floodplain to consider having flood insurance and having that coverage. There was about $648,000 from that was paid out from increased cost of compliance coverage. Sarpy County, Fremont, and Omaha policy holders submitted 38% of the total claims from that time period, and then the average time it took to receive payment was about 64 days. So didn't take too long for policyholders to start seeing some money from their claims. So next, we will get into some of the responsibilities of the floodplain administrator. Now, some of you might be the floodplain administrator for your community, so this will just be an overview of what the expectations are for you within the program. But for those of you who maybe aren't the floodplain administrator for your community, hopefully this will be a good breakdown of what their job responsibility looks like, and you can maybe get a better idea of how to support them within their role. So, the floodplain administrator is an individual within a community that is tasked with implementing the floodplain management program. Now, this is an assigned title within the local ordinance, and it's typically a recognized position within the community office. There's no specific position that is required to have the title of floodplain administrator. It is designated within your community. So, this could be the clerk, treasurer, zoning administrator, emergency manager, anybody that has a community office. Um, and again, that position is assigned within your local ordinance. So if you're not sure who the floodplain administrator is, look in your ordinance or contact us and we can help you with that. There is no minimum training requirement to be a floodplain administrator in Nebraska. There is the option to become a certified floodplain manager, but again, it's not required. We do recommend staying up to date on trainings, though, and attending either our in person or virtual trainings whenever you have the opportunity to. So, as the floodplain administrator, it's important to know your responsibilities and what the expectations are. So, you know how your governing body can support you in your role. It's important to be able to communicate your needs within your role and expectations effectively to your community, and to be confident educating your community members and upholding floodplain regulations. So, again, it doesn't lead to any misinformation or confusion within your community. Now, here are just some of the responsibilities of the floodplain administrator. So, reviewing and approving or denying proposals to develop in the floodplain, issuing permits for settings development standards, maintaining the flood carrying capacity for the floodplain, determining the base flood elevation for proposals, ensuring comprehensive plans account for the floodplain, and following enforcement procedures when non compliant work is being done. All of these responsibilities are again listed out within your community's ordinance. So if you're new to the floodplain administrator program or you have somebody new coming in to fill that role, it's always great to review your ordinance so you understand what the responsibilities and expectations are. Now, these are just some additional responsibilities that are not necessarily directly laid out or stated. So, the floodplain administrator serves as a point of contact for our office at Nebraska Floodplain Management and for FEMA as well. The floodplain administrator is expected to attend FEMA compliance contacts that are hosted by us at the department. These contacts are called community assistance contacts or community assistance visits. And they are just a way for us to check in on your program, see if there's any administrative processes or anything that needs to be updated. So we always appreciate um, attendance with that. The floodplain administrator also serves as local contact for floodplain questions, and these questions again can be related to the floodplain maps, floodplain regulations, or flood insurance within the community. And it's important for the floodplain administrator to stay up to date on floodplain management topics. So, again, attending trainings that are available or just looking over, we send out a newsletter article just with updates about floodplain management. Those are some great ways to stay updated. And then it's the floodplain administrator's responsibility to identify mitigation and flood risk reduction needs. So, if there's any way to reduce the risk of flooding within your community and make the community more resilient, those ideas would start with the floodplain administrator. And then, of course, to participate in floodplain mapping projects, which could be providing feedback when maps are being created and informing of new data that could affect floodplain boundaries. So that will take us into responsibilities of the governing body, which is not something that people typically think of when they think of floodplain responsibilities. They typically place all of that on the floodplain administrator, but there are some expectations for governing bodies within participating communities. Um, the very basic would just be to be aware of the floodplain, both the regulations and the locations. So there's no miscommunications when dealing with the community, with uh, the public within the community. If there are any questions asked, they know who to send them to or what the answers are. The next would be to support the floodplain administrator to ensure the community remains eligible for for federal flood insurance. Like we mentioned before, if you have a non-compliant program, you are at risk of probation or suspension, which can eliminate the access to federal flood insurance. So, in order to keep those benefits, it's important that the governing body supports the floodplain administrator. For smaller communities, the governing body might be responsible for hearing requests for appeals or variances from the floodplain ordinance. Um, the governing body should be able to consult the floodplain administrator for floodplain guidance within the community or making decisions within the community. And then participating in floodplain mapping meetings. So, when a community is getting updated floodplain maps, there are a few different meetings that take place within the community. There is the project kickoff, flood risk review meetings, and then the public open house. That participation is greatly appreciated or expected. And we will kind of break down um, the responsibilities for each of those meetings in just a minute. So, when should leadership get involved in the floodplain program? When there are different types of development projects taking place or large community projects that require working closely with the governing body, um, it's important to get involved and think of floodplain management early in the project when you're in the planning stages. So everybody is on the same page, and floodplain requirements stay a big part of the project. Um, Governing bodies should get involved when ensuring the community is participating in local or regional hazard mitigation planning efforts. So again, when you're doing planning projects for the community, getting leadership involved with the floodplain aspect is really important. Reviewing any updates to floodplain regulations. If you're updating anything within your ordinance, it's a good idea to get leadership involved to review any updates to the regulations and get support for that. Supporting enforcement efforts by the floodplain administrator. So, if there are any violations or potential violations within the community, getting the support of your leadership can help make that process towards compliance a little bit easier. And then when reviewing changes to the floodplain maps. So here's where we'll kind of break down the different meetings and kind of expectations for those different stages of a mapping project. Starting with the project kickoff. Um, so we will set up a meeting with your community um, that will provide we will meet with your community so your community can provide information to help make the maps. So, this would be providing us with road names, corporate boundaries, or your extraterritorial jurisdictions. If there's any survey data or as built data that would help benefit the creation of the maps, anything like that is what we would expect your community to help provide us. This just helps make ensure that these maps are made to the best that they can be. And then it is the community's responsibility to ensure that floodplain maps are accessible within the community um, and sending out reminders to existing floodplain or existing to community members about the existing floodplain boundaries, raising awareness of what the boundaries currently look like, and raising awareness of a mapping update is really important. And then it's also the community's responsibility to review current boundaries for accuracy and provide comments to the mapping project coordinator. So, letting us know if there's something that doesn't look correct within the community's maps will really help create the best final product. And then the second meeting that occurs is the flood risk review meeting. So, um, It's important that community leadership attend the flood risk review meetings to review the draft data. Again, checking over for accuracy, making sure that things look correct for your community. Reviewing the work maps for alignment with comments provided to our agency when we are creating these maps, making sure that everything gets addressed. And then providing comments on draft floodplain boundaries. There's a 30-day comment period where these comments can be issued on the draft maps and changes can be made. And then attending public open houses to and be available for questions with the community. Again, participation when it comes to mapping updates, participation within the community is extremely important, and it's kind of falls on the community to spread awareness that these mapping updates are being done and notifying people in your community that might be affected by it. And then the last stage for when the preliminary maps are being released, it's the responsibility of community leadership to attend the meeting with our department to review the preliminary floodplain maps. This is typically the invite to this meeting is typically sent to the floodplain administrator and community leadership. Um, and then the community must submit technical appeals during the 90-day appeals period and review the summary of map action document that lists out um, how existing letters of map change might be affected by this mapping update. Um, Now, those changes aren't sent out to property owners, so it's again the responsibility of the community to communicate those mapping changes with the property owners, reaching out and letting them know. Okay, so now we'll go over different ways that you can sort of customize your floodplain program to better fit the needs of your community. I think this is a great way if you are experiencing some concerns or pushback within your community about your floodplain program. Finding a way to make your program work for your community can help curb the frustrations and concerns and maximize the benefits that your community receives from this program. So, the one of the most basic ways that you can customize your floodplain program is by customizing your local standards. You can do this by updating your local floodplain ordinance. So, again, um, your floodplain programs are enforced at the local level through the community ordinance. That ordinance has to meet federal and state minimum standards, but there are other standards that are optional or higher standards that you can incorporate into your program that will either make your community safer or more resilient from flooding, or just help standardize your procedures within your community. Our new model ordinance, at the very end of it, it includes a guide to optional or higher standards. This guide lists out different language or regulations that you can include within your ordinance. It gives kind of a breakdown on how it could be beneficial and then how to incorporate it in within your ordinance. Now, this isn't a complete list of all of the optional or higher regulations that your community could adopt, but it is a pretty substantial list that you can pick from. And these regulations include ways to prohibit certain forms of development within your community or within the floodplain or the floodway, which could help cut down on some of the permitting requirements by just prohibiting that type of development. Um, there are additional permitting or administrative procedure steps or regulations that you can incorporate. You can increase protection for development based on your community's flood risk. So, if your flood risk is um, greater, you can increase protection for that. Or you could reduce the allowable encroachment impacts on floodwater elevations. So we will give a couple examples of how you can customize your program. One example is by setting limits on permit validity. So typically, with floodplain permits, the developer has 180 days for construction to begin once a floodplain permit is issued. And then the floodplain permit is typically valid for the duration of construction. Now, your community can set time limits on how long these permits are valid, which would require developers to reapply or request to renew their permit after a certain point. This is really a good idea for um, long construction projects, communities that have higher flood risk, or that maybe they're getting new floodplain maps. Um, your flood risk and your maps can change during the length of long construction projects. So by having a expiration date on this permit, it ensures that the developers are routinely aware of floodplain requirements during the project and that the project is staying in compliance with your potentially changing flood risk. Um, so this is a great option. It sets a um, standard for the permits that you issue within your community. And another example, again, there are several different options for the optional language or higher standards that are available to your community to adopt. But another one that is good is adopting a higher freeboard requirement. Now, um, the flood risk is not the same for all communities across Nebraska. There are some Nebraska communities that have super old, maybe inaccurate floodplain maps that do not address the current flood risk within the community. Um, by adopting a higher freeboard standard, you can protect your community from larger floods. Um, and it will help reduce the damage within your community. Now, it may cost more upfront to increase the elevation of a structure, but it could help save property owners in the community money in the long run by reducing um, the cost of damages over a set period of years. Now, it's been found that communities save around $7 for every $1 spent on resilience. So, by paying more for that mitigation, you save yourself money when it comes to damages later on. And then property owners have been found to save around 20% per year on flood insurance costs. So by having higher standards, you can increase the benefits that your community receives from the program, which is always a great thing. When you are customizing your community's floodplain regulations, it's important to be sure that these regulations fit your community's needs. You shouldn't adopt any language that you or the community are not prepared to enforce. So if you're um, already receiving some pushback, it may not be feasible to enforce even stricter standards that might be available. And there are a few things that you should consider before adopting new regulations. So, current land use designations and pre existing structures within the floodplain. So, you um, if your community doesn't have a ton of agricultural land, some of the agricultural language may not be necessary for your community. If you have RV parks or existing manufactured homes within your communities, inserting or adopting language that prohibits those kinds of structures within your community may not be the best fit. So it's important to take that into account when adopting regulations. You should also consider staffing capabilities and time commitment on additional administrative procedures. So if your community is already short on staffing availability, or your floodplain administrator does not have the time commitment to do additional administrative procedures, um, again, some of those regulations may not be the best fit for your community. It's important to take to account your community's flood history. So if your community does experience frequent or um, heavier floods, again, doing those higher standards to protect your community could be a good option. And then it's important to look at previous precedents that are set by other regulations. So when you're updating your floodplain ordinance, take a look at other ordinances within your community that could um, affect or contradict what you're setting in the floodplain ordinance. Um, Another way to customize your program is to customize administrative procedures. So, we always recommend creating written administrative procedures to ensure consistent application of regulations across community offices. And then these procedures are set in place to pass on to future floodplain administrators. So, if you have clear written procedures, there's no confusion on what the process is and who's involved in the floodplain administration. For some communities, like we mentioned, the governing body can take a more hands on approach with floodplain operations. Again, just setting up that standard for what works within your community. There are some communities that have leadership or the board discuss and vote on larger floodplain project proposals. If you think that would work best for your community, you can definitely try to implement that. And then you can also adjust the designation of floodplain administrator to be for more effective management. So, um, some options that might work better for your community if they're not already designated as the floodplain administrator is looking at the zoning administrator or building inspector, a position where permits are already being sent to for just typical zoning or building regulations. If they see those permits first, and it would make more sense for them to also look at floodplain regulations, you can change the designation within your community's ordinance. You would just amend that designation. Again, it's just about what finding what works best for your community and making a more efficient program that works for you guys. Um, Another option is joining the Community Rating System or the CRS program. Now, this is a voluntary program within the National Flood Insurance that helps communities receive insurance discounts for adopting those higher standards. So, when a higher standard is adopted, it earns the community points, which leads to insurance discounts. Again, just another way to increase the benefits for your community and help sort of garner support. From your community members. Now, if you are interested in joining the rating system, it's important to, again, consider those factors that we talked about. There is an increase in administrative time that can be required by joining the community rating system. So, if that doesn't work for your community, it may not be the right option for you. But if you would like more information, you can contact us about that. So, quickly, we'll just finish up with different tips and resources that can help you learn more about the National Flood Insurance Program and help you spread information within your community. Um, so, just again, uh, discuss creating a more resilient future within your community. Floodplains are inherently more hazardous areas, and flooding is the most frequently reported hazard within Nebraska. It's estimated that in a 30-year mortgage, a home in a special flood hazard area has a 26% chance of experiencing a flood. And Nebraska's climate models are showing that Nebraska is just getting wetter. Our springs, in particular, are getting wetter, while our summers are getting drier. Um, Storms or events will increase in frequency, increase in scale and intensity, and decrease in predictability. So, um, building that resilience up before a disaster strikes is extremely important. Get your board involved while you can. This will help um, garner support and just understanding of the program. You're more than welcome to invite leadership to join on the compliance contacts, the community assistance contacts, or community assistance visits to help show the importance of maintaining compliance within the program and enforcing floodplain regulations. By joining these contacts, they can ask questions and just learn about the floodplain requirements and administrative procedures or expectations of the floodplain administrator. Again, get their input on ordinance updates, discuss floodplain project proposals with them, and share floodplain trainings with them. Most of our trainings are recorded and added on our website. So if they're not able to attend virtually or in person, those are always available online. Keep your community educated. So, keeping your board informed on updates to the floodplain and regulations. We recommend giving periodic presentations to or at board meetings or town meetings just to provide those updates. And gaining more community support validates the importance of being in the program and staying compliant. So, again, educating your community on the flood risk and benefits they're receiving is a great way to earn that support. You can do that by providing outreach materials on different aspects of the program and just being easily accessible. You can find a lot of materials on our website, on our digital desk reference, which Michelle posted a link in the chat for you. And then ask for help. Ask for help. You can reach out to our division for technical assistance for any resources. We've in the past we've been able to present at town meetings to just share information about floodplain regulations in the National Flood Insurance Program. Um, and we can help you find information on your community's program as well. If you don't want to reach out to us, we also recommend collaborating with other floodplain administrators to stay up to date on neighboring community floodplain events or just to ask questions about relevant experience. If you need contact information for floodplain administrators in neighboring communities or just in Nebraska, we do have a floodplain administrator search page on our website where you can search up a community and it will provide contact information for that floodplain administrator. Just some additional resources that can help with communicating floodplain management. FEMA has some communications toolkits that are available for guidance on engaging with the public during a mapping process. There are some success stories and engagement strategies that are available within these documents. And there's a document specifically for strategies for rural communities as well that are available. And then just some additional resources. Again, if you need to update or customize your floodplain regulations, uh, you can do that by adopting a new ordinance. You can review our new model ordinance that is available to Nebraska communities now. Um, any outreach materials, technical bulletins that are available on our website are free for you guys to use and distribute within your communities. Attending our virtual or in person trainings that cover a wide variety of topics, again, are recorded and posted for you guys to review later on. And then there is an additional resource that is Understanding and Managing Flood Risk, a guide for elected officials. This is a three-part guide that outlines responsibilities and different floodplain aspects that is also available on our digital desk reference. Again, just we'll plug our social media. Feel free to follow us for any updates on floodplain regulations, trainings, general floodplain information. We would appreciate that follow. And then our contact information, feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any floodplain questions.